Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 18th of June 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, Xcom coming to iOS at a $20 price tag. Dead Rising 3 will be more mature and sophisticated, because that'll go well. Games are traded in because they're too short, claims a developer at Avalanche Studios, and we'll have a roundup of this week's releases. All this and the OC Remix track of the day is coming your way right about now. We've known for a while, of course, that Xcom was being ported to iOS, one of the more ambitious port projects, considering that the game appears to be identical, with the exception of lower texture quality and frame rate, as well as a lack of maps. However, what we didn't know, of course, was how much it's going to cost. When it comes out on the 20th, it will be $20, £14 or €17.99. This makes it one of the most expensive pay-up-front iOS games in existence, following up on the initial price of Soul Calibur, as well as some of the Final Fantasy titles. The game's multiplayer will not be ready for launch, however, it will be released as a free update later. The game also features cloud saving, however, it's not compatible with PC, so it's cloud save that will go between your iPad, iPhone, and iPod Touch, as opposed to your iPad and your PC, which would have actually been useful. But I guess it's a little bit difficult to do cloud saving when you don't have the same number of maps available. That would be my theory. The ability to save in the middle of a map, for instance, that doesn't exist on the other platform would pretty much render that impossible. So when it comes down to the cost, I've got to say that I actually kind of think this is a good thing, and it seems like a lot of people would turn their nose up at paying $20 for an iOS game, but in reality, you're not actually paying $20 for an iOS game. You're paying $20 for what was a PC and console game, which originally cost between $50 and $60, and is almost an identical port with a couple of little things reduced, like texture quality and like the number of maps. Then charging $20 for that actually does seem pretty reasonable, and I've got to say, there is a serious lack of core gaming experiences on those devices. Now, when I was talking about Deus Ex The Fall, I said that the platform is not conducive to the third or first-person core gaming experience. Anything that really requires a controller, for instance, it's not conducive to. However, there are core games which would work just fine on a tablet device, and turn-based strategy titles are one of those things. I would play Xcom on an iPad. I would, if I wasn't already done with Enemy Unknown as it is. I don't really have any more desire to play Enemy Unknown. It has too many flaws in terms of its design ideology as well as some of its mechanics to really keep me playing. I played about 100 hours of that game. And hey, I can safely say I got my money's worth of it, but a lot of it involved restarting for frustrating reasons, and like, I spent a lot of time with the game, but the time that I spent with it, most of the time wasn't quality time. A lot of it was actually kind of frustrating, and frustrating for the wrong reasons. I get that it's supposed to be a hard game. I'm fine with that. I played and beat the original Xcom. I'm looking into Xenonauts right now as an interesting alternative. I like hard titles. But what I don't like is titles that intentionally dick you over and whose rule set is very clearly not consistent. I've had quite enough of aliens shooting me through walls and the nonsense involved in moving to the wrong square because one square to the left would have actually given you that flank, even though looking at the perspective it clearly looks like this guy is not in hard cover, yet he is anyway, and you can't undo the move and it's the two-move system and blah blah. You get the idea, yeah? There's a lot of stuff in that game that I really dislike, and I simply desired to play another game like it, even if it wasn't perfect. However, the point is that anything that's mouse-driven that doesn't require a large amount of speed will pretty much work on a tablet device. In fact, in some instances, I would say it's even more enjoyable. I would like to play SRPGs on, say, a tablet, yeah? Because traditionally, SRPGs have been done with a controller, and it's actually really clunky, yeah? What I'd like to do is say, alright, point here, go here. Whereas on a controller, I have to move along, select the unit, and then push up, and then to the right, and then up again in order to actually get to the right place, which is not really that good. You know, I'm going back to the days of Shining Force and Final Fantasy Tactics and things like that. I think there's definitely a place for a lot of titles like that on that system, and more to the point, the only way you're really going to get a lot of very in-depth core experiences that actually have the production values behind it and have the team behind it is if you're able to establish games at a higher price point. And right now, this is very difficult to do. very difficult. Unless you happen to be Square Enix, and they are consistently hammered for their policies when it comes to mobile devices, you are going to have a very tough time selling those titles. I had a tough time convincing people to buy Ghost Trick for like $7. Yeah, because like, oh, that's too expensive for an iOS game. So, are you kidding me? Like, that game was $40 on DS and is one of the best gaming experiences that I've had in the past 5 years, and people won't pick it up because they're used to paying either 69 cents or 99 cents or $1.99 for an iOS title. And that is completely unsustainable if you want a big, proper gaming experience. You cannot afford to do that. You might think, oh, well, just go for volume sales. The market is oversaturated. You can't go for volume sales unless you hit it big, like Words with Friends or Angry Birds or something along those lines. Then you're in serious trouble. If you sell too low and you only end up selling X number of copies that just doesn't pay back the cost of development, then you're in serious trouble there. And to be fair, how many games would you have to sell to actually pay the number of people that work at a studio like Firaxis? And that's not even a big studio. Think about something like Infinity Ward, for instance. I mean, good lord. Or Treyarch. Or Blizzard. It would be pretty damn difficult. There's a reason why an awful lot of those companies are going down the free-to-play route, because it's initially more attractive to people, and it's also a good way of getting more money out of people over time. The big initial paywall is not that popular on iOS, and I think that needs to change. If iOS wants to be taken seriously as a platform, if iOS devices want to have a lot of core gaming experiences on them, then we do need to see that price raise on the big titles. We cannot sustain games like Xcom on 99-cent purchases. It just isn't going to happen. Otherwise, what you're going to see is even more of this in-app purchase nonsense, and it's terrible. I mean, you think PC free-to-play gaming is bad? You have no idea. iOS is the Wild West in that respect, and they do not care. Pay to win? They're totally fine with that. Gouging you for currency? They're totally fine with all of those things. And that will continue unless we can successfully sell core games on the iOS platform at a reasonable amount. It's kind of funny, isn't it? I am actually legitimately arguing that more expensive games is good for the consumer. Well, if you've seen the iOS free-to-play market, you know exactly why. When Dead Rising 3 was shown at the Xbox conference at E3, it was probably the most disappointing thing I've ever seen. The once bonkers zombie survival franchise that is perhaps the only game where you can go around beating zombies with a large stuffed animal while controlling a male photojournalist who's only wearing a pair of hot pants and a halter top seems to have vanished and been replaced by brown, gritty survival action. Dead Rising 3 showed a rather changed color palette as well as an open world. Admittedly, both previous titles did involve an open world kind of setting as well. In this case, you saw a protagonist that might as well be called Gruff McGrufferson call in airstrikes and artillery using his cell phone. Capcom has already admitted that Dead Rising 3's approach is designed to appeal to Call of Duty fans, providing a more serious tone and realistic approach. Destructoid reported on the hands-off demo that was showed at E3, and unfortunately, it would appear to be little more than just that. They described a Resident Evil-like section where, down in a sewer, you had no light source and were essentially forced to use nothing but the pistol with the flashlight attached to it. They also reported calling in airstrikes that leveled city blocks, as well as a drone attack. Needless to say, this paramilitary feel was certainly not a part of the original two titles that were bizarre in the best kind of ways as far as I'm concerned, with a nice juxtaposition between a fairly serious storyline and completely outrageous characterization, voice acting, and overall ridiculous over-the-top violence. Needless to say, those of us that appreciated the previous two titles are not that pleased, and it really comes down to the fact that Dead Rising was actually interesting. In a sea of zombie games, Dead Rising did things differently. The overall tone was not dark, even though it had some dark humor. It was not gritty, even though there were occasionally sad moments. There was a lot of freedom in that game, in the sense that you could run around, grab almost any object in the world, and use it as a weapon, which at the time was something that hadn't really been done before. It was very much an open world. In the first game, it was based inside a sprawling shopping mall and the surrounding grounds. In the second game, it was based inside a party city, essentially, with all sorts of different crazy stuff going on. The third game appears to be set in some kind of post-apocalyptic ruined metropolis, and while it promises more open world, I have to say that it does not look all that interesting. My concern as well is that they will take away some of the more unique elements that were actually quite controversial. The first one being that the save system in that game involved you actually going to a restroom in order to save. Now, what this meant is that you just couldn't give up and save in the middle of a level and come back to it later. The point being that traveling around the world was supposed to be risky in some way. They wanted to add that sense of danger, and they wanted to force the player to plan his movements carefully. This was nicely accented by the fact that the game had a time system, whereby certain events would only happen at certain times, and if you missed them, then that was it. They were pretty much gone for good. It was also a game that encouraged you to restart and play through again, considering it was a 3-day period whereby you would maintain your levels and your special abilities from playthrough to playthrough. So you would eventually end up in a position where you would be dominant against enemies that would otherwise very easily kill you. It had a lot of very interesting ideas that some people turned around and said, well, we don't really like that because it's not very similar to what we're used to. But that's the thing, Dead Rising wasn't similar to what we were used to. Dead Rising was one of the more original franchises to come from Capcom over the past 10 years, and in my opinion, it was absolutely phenomenal. And it was because it was different. It's like asking for Dark Souls to remove the bonfire system, for instance. Dead Rising is very much a hardcore title. I think that people miss that because it has a sense of humor, and it's got a lot of really silly stuff going on in it. It's still very much a hardcore game. It's a game about learning the environment, about figuring out exactly where everything is. It's a game about planning your time out and not taking unnecessary risks. It's a game about resource management, where every weapon can break. It's a game where you have to be extremely careful and you have to learn what the game's rules are. That's very similar to Dark Souls, and of course the Demon Souls. And yet, of course, suggesting that we change Dark Souls would be a travesty. As far as I'm concerned, suggesting that we should change Dead Rising 3 so it will be more appealing to a wider audience is pretty damn ridiculous. The game did reasonably well, honestly. In 2010, it had sold 1.8 million units. By this point, of course, it will be well over 2 million, and they also released the off-the-record version of the game, which sold additional copies and was, in fact, just kind of a mini expansion pack and designed for people that hadn't picked up the original Dead Rising 2 in the first place. According to the Capcom Investor Relations page, the series has sold 5.4 million copies. That is something I would consider to be fairly successful. The decision to go with the brown color palette and take away the wackiness of the game seems like it would absolutely bury the series. And it also seems to be ridiculously exploitative because it is basically selling out. You know, the real definition of selling out. The idea that you change yourself into something that you don't want to do in order to appease a wider market. That's pretty much exactly what that means, and it's also exactly what Dead Rising is currently doing. Yes, there is currently a trend for gritty zombie survival games. That's a thing right now. Dead Rising has been around for a long time. It was one of the early titles to come out for the Xbox 360, pretty much one of the strongest killer apps to come out in its early lifespan. And now they're going to change it around because they feel that market forces are blowing in a different direction. Well, that really sucks for people that actually bought all the Dead Rising games, and me being one of them, I am definitely rather disappointed. It's not like it's a reboot like Devil May Cry was, it's not like it's a particularly old series, and it's not like we had a bunch of games in that series either, so yeah, I am definitely very concerned about this, and it most likely will end up being terrible as a direct result, but we will see. The discussion on used games continues after Nintendo fired a salvo across the bows of Microsoft by saying, well, if you made better games, then trading in wouldn't be a problem. We have the guys behind Just Cause and the forthcoming Mad Max title, Avalanche Studios, saying that the reason that games get traded in so much is that they're too short or offer little motivation to actually return to them. Now, of course, this is coming from the developer of a series of open-world games. Avalanche founder Christopher Sonberg claims that he very rarely sees copies of Just Cause 2 available on the used game aisle, and goes on to talk about the idea that if you can play through a game in 8 to 10 hours, then there is no reason for players to actually play it again. If you're offering little variation, he says, then there's no motivation for the player to actually keep the game unless they want to have a nice bookshelf. It'd certainly not be the only developer that's now come out in favor of used games. It's pretty good from a PR standpoint. We had Warren Spector claiming that games prices were too high, which is why people were trading in as many games as they were. We had the guys over at Take-Two saying that, you know, you should just provide a more engaging experience and that they weren't really too worried about it. And to be fair, we even have EA distancing themselves from the policies of Microsoft right now, which is interesting because they most likely were involved in some way in pushing them in that direction to begin with. I don't imagine that they were the sole reason for it, but if publishers were not consulted on that decision, then I think we are living in a world where Microsoft is out of its mind. It's very, very likely that they were consulted. However, right now, the good PR standpoint is to say, no, we're fine with used games. You know, it's totally cool. Now, let's go on to the argument of Sonberg in question, and I think it's very easy to make this argument when all you do is make open-world games. Yeah, there's no real reason to trade back in Just Cause 2 because there's a ton of content in that game. I think just go back in that game and screw around, and that's one of the real strengths of it. The problem is that those titles are not so much few and far between, but they're definitely not in the majority. And it's not like the other developers are doing it wrong, it's that they're not making open world games. There are weaknesses to open world titles, as much as people would like to think otherwise. Just Cause 2 is definitely not the best game ever, even though it's very, very good. I mean, as a game that has a story-driven experience, it's pretty terrible. The actual gunplay in that game is lousy at best. The strength that the game actually has is the complete turn-it-up-to-11 attitude that it presents. The notion of hijacking a plane by jumping onto another plane, for instance. Driving a car off a cliff and then opening a parachute, parachuting onto a boat and then driving away, and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. That's a strength of the game, but not everybody wants that experience all the time, and I actually have a feeling that it would get very, very tiring if most games were providing that. We believe that a lot of games were going towards open world, but it doesn't seem to really be the case, with not a marked increase in the number of open world releases. But I tend to find that open world games are almost always enjoyable, and yes, there's plenty of content there, but the content in question is not of the best quality. Just Cause 2, as I was saying before, yeah, it's got this big open world, but a lot of the missions in it are very, very samey. It's like, go here, escort this, deliver this. You know, very MMO-like in that respect. A lot of open world games do tend to do that. They sacrifice the quality of the questing and the quality of the gameplay in order to get that big world. We're not really in a space yet where you can do both, as much as I would like to say otherwise. Plenty of other examples of that, stuff like Prototype, games like Infamous, for instance. These games are limited in the sense that their gameplay suffers as a result of being open world. Now, I think there's a place for games that are 8 to 10 hours. In fact, I think there's a place for games that are even shorter than that. As someone that has very limited time to play games, I would love a bunch of 2 to 3 hour games as long as they were appropriately priced, yeah? And this is where I hope the industry ends up going, especially once we start to really go towards digital on the next gen of consoles. I want to see shorter games with more interesting concepts and focus on quality. Like 3 hours of great gameplay versus 8 to 10 hours of kind of middling filler gameplay with the occasional big moments. Yeah, I would play a lot of games like that, but only if they were appropriately priced. You can't charge $60 for that, and you can't just tack on a multiplayer mode and say, oh, well, this will keep them on the shelf. No, it won't. Most of those progression-based multiplayer modes are actually failures. They turn into ghost towns very, very quickly, and the ones that stick around are the ones that offer the experience that people are very much used to and are confident buying into every year, stuff like Call of Duty or Battlefield. At this point, I am coming to the conclusion that the biggest flaw that the games industry currently has, especially the AAA games industry, is its lack of flexibility. It wants to make an 8 to 10 hour campaign with a multiplayer mode and 3 to 4 DLC packs. That seems to be the standard for AAAs, and it's going to be $60, and it's going to be on these platforms, and it's going to have this kind of tutorial, this kind of control set, and use these kind of mechanics, yeah? There is no flexibility outside of that, yeah? You can't have these companies make a 3 hour experience and sell it for $15. which is kind of surprising because that works. It really, really does. Portal is considered to be one of the best games ever made because it was a 3-hour experience that never actually had any filler. It was a perfect, delicious slice of gameplay. And that was that. It had some replayability in the terms of the time trials and the actual modding and level editing capabilities, but in reality, most people played through Portal, had a satisfying experience, and then were done with it, yeah? And that was actually great, because when Portal 2 came out, it sold like a bazillion copies. So it's a pretty good way of establishing new IPs. And I've been hammering on, I think, about this whole pricing idea and just a lack of flexibility in game development for a while. But if games are costing a huge amount of money to make, where they actually require 7 to 8 to even 12 million copies to recoup the cost, then I think another look has to be taken at the way these games are being made. Especially if you're spending like $100 million making a game that gets traded in inside of a week. You've made a mistake there, clearly. And finally, look at the release list. It's actually surprisingly sparse this week, but we'll look at what we've got anyway. So, available this week, funnily enough, probably the biggest title is actually a Saturn-era brawler called Dungeons & Dragons Chronicles of Mystara, coming out for Wii U, PlayStation 3, PC, and Xbox Live. This actually looks amazing. It really, really does. It's one of those games that I wanted to have on my Saturn and never got. It was one of those perfect 4-player brawlers that was taken from the arcade era. You actually had to get a RAM expansion card, and you had to import this thing for it to actually be available on the Saturn, and I am really looking forward to playing it. I love brawlers, I really, really do, and as far as I'm concerned, this one should be absolutely phenomenal. It's supposedly coming to PC, but there's no listing on Steam yet. Even if you search for it, we'll actually find a page, but that page is blank and just moves you back to the store. So I don't really know what's going on there or how much it'll cost. It'll probably be $15, I would imagine, but it looks like it will be very much worthy of your time. Aside from that, we've got Epic Mickey 2 making its way to PlayStation Vita, which is not exactly the best title of all time, not very well reviewed, and unfortunately it didn't appear to be a good experience. Giana Sisters making its way to PlayStation 3, if you happen to miss out on that and you don't have a PC, in which case, why the hell are you watching this channel? Knights of Pen and Paper Plus 1 edition is coming on June the 18th, that being today, and that is also for PC. This is actually worth looking at. I played this on the iPad, and it's a pretty enjoyable experience. It's a rather interesting fourth wall breaking approach to a more traditional RPG, whereby you actually do play as the guys playing the pen and paper RPG. And there's a dungeon master who's kind of narrating things. You can even upgrade stuff in real life to affect the game. It's got a nice sense of humor to it and a few interesting twists, and the Plus One edition does feature some additional content as well as improvements for the PC. Jak and Daxter Collection making its way to PlayStation Vita. That is the HD remake of Jak and Daxter 1, 2, and 3. Very well might be worth playing indeed. That's something to tide you over on the Vita. And we also have a title called Storm coming to PlayStation 3. This is a puzzler which involves manipulating wind, lightning, snow, and rain to solve puzzles at your own pace. So, yeah, it seems to be a fairly kind of laid-back puzzle title from what I can tell there. Aside from that, we also have Castlevania Lament of Innocence, which is a PlayStation 2 classic, alongside Corvette Evolution GT, which, of course, everybody really, really wants. And the big release for this week on the consoles on June the 20th is most likely going to be Super Luigi U, which is, of course, the expandalone title for New Super Mario Bros. For Wii U. We've also got Mag Runner Pulse on June the 20th coming to PC, which is a first-person puzzle game involving manipulating the forces of magnetism. And we also have, finally, Fist Puncher making its way to Steam on June the 21st, which is a retro-inspired brawler. And I believe actually features Jesse Cox and Dodger, so, you know, there's an endorsement if you ever heard one. Alright folks, that's me pretty much done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch. However, before I go, I would like to give you the OC Remix track of the day, if you wouldn't mind. If you do mind, I don't actually care in any way, shape, or form. So, King of Fighters, because why the hell not? Is there ever a time when King of Fighters is not appropriate? I asked my guys over in South Korea and they confirmed no indeed there is not. So, we have a track here from King of Fighters 2000, which is a remix of the song KD0084, and the remixer is Gecko Yamori. The original composer is Shensekai I'm not even going to try that. No, that's terrible. Let's not even. It would be insulting. It's a remix very much in the classic style, enhanced and pretty damn good. Nothing particularly special or out of the ordinary, just an enjoyable track to listen to. So there you go, folks. My name has been TotalBiscuit, and I'll see you next time.